morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us again. I think everybody that we have so far was here yesterday, so I'm really happy to begin this new session, which is the role of policy in creating or mitigating disparity, institutionalizing help and hardship. I think you all know, obviously, that I'm Neve, the organizer of this conference. And I will turn it over to Ariane, who has very graciously agreed to chair this panel for me this morning, who will give a bit more of an introduction.
Okay, great. Welcome to day 2 of this really exciting conference. Yesterday was a really engaging and insightful set of talks, including ours, which now seems a bit like a strange way to start this. But I did want to say, oh, sorry, my computer's like, I want to restart now. I'm like, no, I'm in the middle of something. Excuse me for that. Anyway, it's just a really delightful opportunity for me to be able to chair this panel, which is particularly highlighting the ways that policymakers can contribute to the creation of hardship, but also the other side of that, which would be maybe mitigating some of its effects. We have 3 papers. We're going to have each paper present 20 minutes and then save our questions for a broader kind of discussion around 30 minutes towards the end. This is the moment that I will introduce our first paper, which is written by Fabian, Anna Alexandrova, Yamini, Cinamon-Nair, and the title is Coproducing Wellbeing Policy, a Theory of Thriving in Financial Hardship. So I will pass it over to you, and I'll send you a little note around 15 minutes if you like, Mark.
Perfect, yeah, thanks. Okay, I'll share my slides. Thanks very much for having me at this conference, Nam, and thanks very much for the introduction, Ariane. So this is joint work with Anna Alexandrova and Yamini when we were all at Cambridge together. I'm now at the University of Warwick, and Yamini is in the Greater London Authority. I'm not exactly sure where. She was in the Mayor's office. Now she's, I think, in the City Intelligence Unit. And this is a partnership project with the national charity Turn to Us, and then a bunch of people with lived experience that we collaborated with. I've just got to move here. So I should maybe start by saying that there is one paper associated very specifically with this theory of thriving. So I'll mostly be talking about that, but this is part of a kind of series of broader projects depending on each of the author's interests. So Anna is mostly interested in social science with value-laden concepts like well-being. I'm most interested in kind of conceptualizing a well-being state as an update to the welfare state for the 21st century, something like that. And I work broadly on well-being public policy. And then Anna and I both are quite interested in mid-level theories of well-being, which is sort of context-sensitive applications of well-being thinking. So I had a bit of a think about what in this project would be most relevant to the audience today, and hopefully I got it reasonably right, which is that I guess what thriving means in financial hardship according to people who have a lived experience of financial hardship would be interesting. And then I thought I'd talk a bit about what I see as the potential of co-production to create better public policy. Okay, a bit of background on sort of where we're coming from is that Anna and I think Yamini as well, are quite anti-technocracy in well-being public policy. I have a lot of time for technocracy in central banking and some other areas, but in well-being public policy, it seems quite inappropriate. There is a welcome push, I think, at the moment for well-being public policy, and this is usually conceptualized as going beyond GDP or going beyond kind of neoliberal political economy, certainly going beyond focus in policy evaluation and public management from income and growth and kind of individualism and personal responsibility to something a bit more holistic, both in terms of the outcomes that we're interested in promoting and also thinking more about the social construction of policy outcomes. But I think a lot of the push for this, especially in economics, which is where I came from originally, is very technocratic. So happiness economics is a super technocratic field. A recent example from behavioral public policy by my colleagues, and we chat about this stuff all the time. I'm very good friends with these people. But Paul Freiters, Chris Krekel, Richard Layard, people at the LSE generally see this as we need to come up with metrics first. What is well-being? How do we measure it? This means that the values that are inherent in what makes a life go well are determined by scientists, not by the public. So there's a kind of values by stealth element to this. Rather than starting with politics, what does wellbeing mean to the public? These standardized metrics are then rolled out at the national level, analysed by analysts in central agencies or prestigious universities. Policies derived using quant methods. You don't have a lot of context-sensitive data. And then policy decisions are made on the basis of analytical frameworks like randomized controlled trials and cost-benefit analysis, not on the basis of democratic decision-making. So, as much as I think there are some arguments to be made for this kind of thing, I certainly think that it perpetuates a lot of the very well-established problems with new public management, which was the kind of neoliberal turn in public management theory, or the way governance is done day to day in service delivery. I think new public management had a lot of good things about it that we sometimes forget looking at it today. So what came before it was also shite, but now we've had 40 years of NPM and we can see that it has a lot of excesses and a lot of problems. So a lot of the most common ones are that those affected by the policies have no say in the design of those policies, neither do the people who deliver them. So I think the clearest example of this is in education. Teachers now often have to use standardized slides developed at a kind of regional level. They don't even have autonomy over the classes that they deliver. And then the contextual analysis of, say, the teacher who's delivering the class, or nurses in a hospital, or social workers in a region, don't make it back up to the decision makers in the central authorities at the high levels who are making decisions using their spreadsheets and their kind of limited number of outcomes metrics. And so the complexity of the on-the-ground reality of public policy is kind of obfuscated by this reliance on a very limited set of metrics, like life satisfaction scales in the case of wellbeing policy. Okay, so we are trying to develop a kind of alternate paradigm for wellbeing public policy that's not so technocratic and isn't about like taking science into public policy, but instead starts with politics, starts with the realities of public management. Like, why is it that public management gives us such bad results? How can we do better on that front? And we think that co-production is a very substantial part of this project, or a very big part of this overall story of a wellbeing state. And so we're trying to develop co-production methods specifically for use in wellbeing public policy. And our model of co-production really emphasizes three forms of expertise that need to be brought together and blended so that we get these, what we hope are better outcomes. So that's lived experience, so the people who are affected by the policy itself. We can broaden that out to general stakeholders, but we think in particular the people who are going to be affected by policy should have their values centered in most cases. Then we have practical expertise. So these are the people who implement the policy. We think often the insights of the kind of street level bureaucrats who are at the coalface of delivering public services is missing from scientific analysis of public policy and certainly from policy analysis itself. And I think an important person or an important stakeholder group to acknowledge here as well is the funders. So in the case of charities or other similar enterprises, who is providing the money for these things? They should probably also be part of the conversation. And then we have technical experts like academics, people who have a kind of technical expertise in the subject area. So we try to bring all these groups together, make sure they share power. So the decision-making of the group needs to be shared across everyone. It shouldn't sit with just the academics or sit just with the policy practitioners. And crucially, there's two-way learning. So from the academics' point of view, especially, like, you do not have all the relevant expertise to make a decision about how these things should be done. Everyone has equal knowledge. Everyone has something to learn from other people in the practice. All right. So we piloted this methodology with this national charity Turn to Us, who are digital, so online only anti-poverty group. The main aspects of their work that are relevant to financial hardship are a benefits calculator, which is a sort of online tool where you plug in all your information that's relevant to the welfare system, and it tells you what payments you're entitled to. And then they also give one-off grants, and on the basis of our research, they now give repeat grants, and they also track people longer term than they did before we started with them. And they also have a lot of policy campaigns, and our work was going to feed into that. They do co-production as standard, and I find it very impressive that most UK charities do co-production as standard. Well, a lot of them anyway. A lot of them do co-production as standard. The impetus for this research project was that Turn to Us decided that they wanted to help people thrive, not just survive, and then they needed to know what thriving meant. So they got us in as wellbeing experts to help them with that, and we wanted to co-produce what thriving meant in partnership with the charity and the people that it works with. All right. Now, thriving is, or thriving in financial hardship is a very complex, multifaceted concept. And so we want to use, or I think it necessitates using a qualitative methodology that gives you the kind of rich data that you need to capture all of that complexity, gives you the depth that you need in this theory. At the same time, Turn to Us is a national charity and they have a very large and diverse user base. So we don't want a situation where we sampled poorly for this qualitative data, and now we're getting a very narrow view of what thriving in financial hardship means. So we also need a representative aspect to the methodology, and I think that requires a quantitative approach. So the way we balance that is that we have this 4-stage process, and I'm now working with a much smaller charity where we do parts 1 and 4 differently, more ethnographically. But with Turn to Us, we're very fortunate in that they have a newsletter that goes out to about 5,000 of the people that they have or are currently working with. And we start by surveying them, just some very broad questions about what well-being means to them, or what thriving means to them, what people might miss or misunderstand about their thriving, this kind of stuff. That gives us an initial steer, so we don't go off completely in the wrong direction. Then we had this working group process. So we had 4 people with lived experience, 3 academics, and 5 people from the charity. And I then interviewed another 10 people from the charity. That working group met one-on-one for several months, and group to group. We had some big meetings where everyone was there, and we're just generally talking about thriving and following up on information that comes out of the qualitative process iteratively. We came up with a preliminary theory of thriving, and then we had a workshop where we brought in another 10 people with lived experience, and the original people with lived experience led that workshop, and we sort of tested with the new people whether they agreed with the theory that we'd come up with. We got a few tweaks, but broadly it was well received. And then we again went to the newsletter and asked them to read the report that we had, or the executive summary, and tell us what they thought about it. And broadly, people were very happy. We got a response rate of 1,500 to the first survey. We got 20 responses to the second survey. So how much harder it is to get people to read a 3-page document. All right, this is the working group, just to give you a sense for it. All this was done over Teams, or over Zoom, sorry. I'll turn to the theory of thriving, but I'll give a pretty cursory explanation of it. So in the preliminary results, some of the things that came out as definitive of or characteristic of thriving in financial hardship are things that academics are quite familiar with, things like freedom and autonomy being really important, having your basic material needs met, finding your authentic values, and particularly pressing past cultural expectations like patriarchy in order to find those, and then relationships, and particularly close relationships rather than the quantity or general relationships. Some things, however, were quite unique to the context, and I think it's worth emphasizing both sides of this story, so that general theories of well-being do apply in a lot of different cases, but if we want to do really good work in those contexts, we also need to appreciate what's specific to those contexts. So here we have people saying that they really need advocates that allow them more straightforward and easy access to the welfare system, which in the UK is quite a complicated thing. Avoiding marginalisation and oppression is much more relevant here than if you did this at Eton College. And then strikingly, there was much more of an emphasis on purpose and being able to contribute to something than there was on pleasure and happiness. Basically, pleasure and happiness were completely missing from our qualitative data. That was kind of, those bullet points sort of came out about halfway through the project, and then we tried to bring all these ideas and themes that had come out and into some kind of model that kind of made sense of all of them. And this is what we came up with. So you have this metaphor of a tree, and then you have the means, which is kind of the soil, the process, which is the growth of the tree, and then the outcomes, which is the kind of the leaves and the flowers and this sort of stuff. So the means are what you require to thrive, and we differentiate between practical means like income, housing, mental health, and advocates, and then justice-focused means, which is broader than the roots. You can think of that as the soil, as the environment. So we have political enfranchisement, freedom from oppression, this kind of stuff. A lot of the people who lived experience were emphasizing that even once you have your basic needs met, you don't necessarily know like where you want to take your life. Often you've never had enough space and time and freedom to even ask yourself that question, like, what do I want from your life? Because you're just trying to survive. So the next step after you have that security of means is a process of identifying your intrinsic motivations, your authentic values, and growing into your kind of unique personal tree. And then how do you know when you start to thrive? Well, that's where the outcomes come in. And this was mostly sensations and emotions. So a sense of competence, a sense of autonomy, meaning and purpose, and then connections, relationships, feeling a sense of belonging to some kind of community. Right, now, insofar as the theories of wellbeing developed by academics, I think did pretty well in that they were mostly present in our data, measures developed by academics completely failed. And this is very specific to the context of the charity. So the charity emphasized to us repeatedly, and so did the people with lived experience, that when you come looking for help, if you have to answer a battery of questions to establish what your well-being is like at that time, that's just going to turn you off. You're in desperate circumstances, you've got limited time, limited cognitive capacity, you're going to go somewhere else to try to find help. So we needed a very small number of questions. This basically means that all capability surveys, all psychometric surveys are out. Quantitative measures were quite insensitive to the 3-month treatment window, and life satisfaction scales, which are the kind of preferred metric of a lot of academics and a lot of national statistical authorities, explicitly failed on the problem of adaptive preferences. So 2 of our people with lived experience said that this would be a very bad way to judge their well-being at times. So for example, when they had internalized patriarchy and they thought that domestic violence was normal, they would have said that they were satisfied with their life. But after some consciousness raising, they realized that that was not actually true. So this is a straightforward case of SENS adaptive preferences. Different parts of Turn to Us needed quite different measures. So the campaigns really wanted quant with just a sprinkle of sort of qualitative data. The caseworkers needed much more qualitative information. So we did come up with 2 bespoke measures. So the baseline measure of well-being was a kind of 1 to 7 scale. To what extent do you agree I have the time, space, and resources to plan for the future? And then we'd ask that again afterwards. Oh, sorry, I've just noticed Marianne's chat. Okay, thanks. Okay, cool, thank you. And then in time 2, we'd also ask people, to what extent do you think Turn to Us has helped you obtain the time, space, and resources you need to plan for the future? So this measure was kind of bespoke to that basic means and getting started on the process and getting on a positive trajectory idea that came out from the co-production work, and also specific to what the charity contributes. Whereas I think if we use a general question about life satisfaction or mental health or something, we wouldn't get at the context in which the charity itself is operating. Now, Turn to Us hasn't implemented these measures yet because they want to see how the theory percolates through their work first, but I'm hoping to follow up with them on this front shortly. All right, a couple of quick slides to finish off with on the kind of policy implications of this work. So the first thing that we get when we talk about co-producing policy is always that this is too niche. You're not going to be able to standardize. Economists are obsessed with this idea of how do we compare across jurisdictions. I don't think comparison is actually that important, to be honest, but let's assume that it is. The idea here would be that you could repeat this process at various adjacent nodes of public policy. So if we'd done it with a housing charity and a poverty charity and mental health and debt and something else, then we could get representatives from each of those charities together to develop a slightly higher level, more general theory for all of that sector. And then they could do that with another parallel group where we had different disability sites, blindness, mobility, autism, whatever, and those people got together to do a bigger one for disability policy, and now we get these 2 groups together to do a higher level one for social policy. And we'd lose some of the specificity at each stage, but we'd also notice that some issues are shared across jurisdictions, and now we could think about doing comparisons on that basis. So we'd get a trade-off between specificity and generalizability. One thing that I want to stress is that, or that I think is really promising about co-production, is that it can build trust between funders and evaluators and the people doing the charity work and the people who are receiving the assistance. So those funders can appreciate the complexity of the situation. They can understand how all sorts of measures that might seem a bit woolly or unclear individually, if we put them all together, actually give us a pretty clear picture of how someone's going, how the charity's doing. And they can develop more trust with the people receiving the help, the people delivering the help. And so then you can get messier, more multidimensional metrics, and you don't have to be so strict about the kind of outcomes that you use. doing more research on this over the next few years. So I'll wrap up there. This is a few of the papers that we're publishing out of this project so far. The one I've mostly presented on is at the top, and it should be forthcoming in Journal of Happiness Studies any week. Thanks very much. Should I stop my slides? I'll leave them up for now.
That was great. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, thanks so much, Mark. And even a little bit short on time, which is great for my purposes of chairing. That was really interesting, and I really appreciated hearing the kind of more like, I guess, procedural and stepwise way that co-production actually unfolded in your project. So I'm looking forward to speaking a little bit more about that in the Q&A coming up. But before that happens, we've got two more papers. The next one coming from Matthew Sparks, who's local here in the Department of Sociology at Cambridge. And Matthew's going to talk to us about debt, credit payments, credit payment holidays, and their relationship with mental health during the COVID-19 pandemic in the United Kingdom. And so, Matthew, I will send you a note around 15 minutes, but I think we are ready to send it over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be a part of this panel. Well, I just want to thank Niamh again for inviting me to present at this conference. To a large extent, the themes here are quite well aligned with this paper that I want to present today. And I should also acknowledge my other contributors. To my shame, I didn't include them in the original presentation proposal, but they have been absolutely essential to the development of this paper. And that's Dr. Senhu Wang from the Department of Sociology in Singapore, and Dr. Jacques Wells, both of whom have worked at Cambridge before, but are now based in different places. And this is really a collaborative paper. We've all contributed equally to it, and I want to make sure that their contributions are reflected. And one of the things that we seek to do really is to draw attention to the policy changes during the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's a lot of research that's highlighted the negative effects that occupational and financial disruptions have had on mental health and well-being. And in particular, we've seen that sociological research have highlighted the disproportionate impact that these disruptions have had on women. And although we've seen a lot of studies that have focused on those particular areas, there's been a lot less focus on the consequences of debt over time, particularly the longitudinal element. And that involves the first thing, which is debt status. How has that changed over the pandemic? And the second consideration is in relation to the specific policies that were developed for borrowers to assist borrowers during the pandemic. And we know nothing about how they impacted the mental health of men and women differently. And that's where our paper seeks to make a contribution. I'm not going to focus too much on the first issue here. I want to focus on the second issue, because to some extent, it's rare that as sociologists and as social scientists, we have this opportunity to examine completely different sets of policies. Oftentimes, policy sets, take a long time to shift, and maybe when they do shift, they shift for another extended period of time. Rarely do we have like a moment of insight that allows us to examine the particular effects of these policies. So similar to other key moments that sociologists and social scientists have examined, like, for instance, the 9/11 terrorist attacks on people's health, we view the macroeconomic policy changes implemented during the pandemic, in essence, as a natural experiment to test their uneven impact on individuals' mental health. And in this paper, I want to focus predominantly on one specific policy, which was called the credit payment holiday, which was government endorsed. But I want to set the context initially. So, you're all familiar with neoliberalism and the fact that it's been a dominant economic paradigm since the 1980s. So I'm not going to describe what it is, but I'm happy to have that discussion in the Q&A. I know Ron John yesterday mentioned that it's dead. I take a different position. And in the context of neoliberalism, we saw that it coincided with the financialization of economies like the US and UK. And that was characterized by rising household indebtedness to support the facilitation of home ownership, but also high levels of consumer spending. But there's also been a lot of researchers such as Montgomery and Budenbender and Roberts who have highlighted the uneven gendered impacts of neoliberal policies. In essence, they perpetuate the conditions that disproportionately influence who can access credit, but also the reasons for doing so. And there's also a much smaller body of sociological research, although it's growing, that draws attention to how institutions, policymakers, and firms support particular policies associated with neoliberalism and also financial market functioning. And this can involve debt collection practices, but more specifically to this paper, we refer to something like an individualized financial responsibility discourse, which preaches standards of financial responsibility, frugality, and self-sufficiency, and stigmatizes those who fail to adhere to those particular standards or is seen to fail to adhere to this. I'm sure you've all got many examples of that in your own work about participants and people who you speak to who highlight the effects of this on their mental health. And as a result of that, there is, of course, a lot of research that continuously shows this persistent effect between debt and mental health across multiple indicators, whether it's objective or subjective debt. And we see this pattern occur in country after country after country. But also there's an acknowledgement that debt disproportionately impacts women more than it does men. And prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, we saw that this was extensively researched. And some of this research highlights, the Citizens' Advice, the Christians Against Poverty, they show that when people miss payments, it can generate fear, shame, unease, embarrassment, but also some really important work by Peacock, Bissell and Owen and by Sweet has found that these narratives, these neoliberal narratives, are more likely to be internalized by women who would report seeing their debt as a failure or that they've somehow broken these notions of personal responsibility. But it's also important to note that critics suggest that policymakers and researchers tend to understand debt as an individualized phenomenon and also mental health associated with it as an individualized phenomenon. In essence, there's an idea that the problem is with the person, and if we just get them to talk more or open up a little bit, that this will somehow solve the problem, and therefore the political economic context is obscured, the role of governing bodies and policies is obscured and hidden, and ultimately neoliberals' role in shaping health inequalities is often obscured. So what we want to do here is focus on a particular policy change during the COVID-19 pandemic to really highlight this notion that it's the political economic context that is crucial to fostering these gendered links between debt and mental health. And so during the pandemic, we all know that what happened. We're very mindful that there was a key shift in the kinds of policy making that was adopted, some of which occurred at a dizzying speed, some of which was astonishing given the narratives that we heard throughout the austerity period that many of these things were not possible. And we saw an abandonment of the neoliberal policies in favor of some Keynesian style interventions. And we saw it in a range of areas. But one of the most important provisions for borrowers was this government-endorsed credit payment holiday, which in essence permitted borrowers to make no repayments under a credit agreement for a specified period of time. And it was widely adopted. There was more than 5 million credit agreements that were provided with a payment holiday, which was unique in its operation. I can't see any other instance in which people could miss payments, that this was agreed and there would be no consequences whatsoever. And as a consequence of that, it was regarded as an unprecedented measure by leading institutions, the FCA, the Bank of England, for instance. And what they said is that it was based on a short-term assumption that the economic shock from the pandemic would be temporary, that money will needed as a short-term to kind of smooth over income differences, and that the pressure on the banks needed to be reduced in order to support market functioning. But actually, what was crucial about this is that it highlighted this distinction between two different ways of dealing with debts, or the different policies that were put forward. And the credit payment holiday, although it has been around in the past, the one in the pandemic was unique in how it treated borrowers who actually took up the scheme and therefore defaulted on their credit agreements. In essence, they were not considered to be in default or arrears. Firms were encouraged to grant payment holidays regardless of the circumstances. If someone requested it, they could be granted and they didn't have to justify it in any way. In essence, I kick myself sometimes for not taking this opportunity just to have a break from some of the credit agreements that I have access to, just to kind of free up some of the financial burdens, because there really wasn't much consequence. Firms were advised not to note this on an individual's credit report, and therefore no impact on their credit scores. And also, there was no fees generated or charges generated for anyone who took out this policy. So we can see, to some extent, these were quite revolutionary in the context of the neoliberal political economic context of debt. And the implementation of these policies reveal how quickly the policy goals can change, how previous assumptions can be discarded for a new policy set. And in that context, it provides a really unique opportunity, this natural experiment for us to examine the mental health impacts of intervening on debt via alternative public policy. And of course, given that I've highlighted debt disproportionately impacts women, then the psychological of debt during the pandemic and the specific policies adopted, we can see how they might influence, you know, this slightly higher prevalence of mental health among women who are in debt. So really, there were three questions, but I'm just narrowing it down to two for the purposes of this presentation. The first really tries to explore, you know, did this credit payment holiday moderate the relationship between debt and mental health during the pandemic? And the second one seeks to examine whether there were any gender differences in that effect. And given all the kind of backdrop of this literature, we do make specific hypotheses. We suggest that that firstly, the credit payment holiday will result in a more prevalent subjective, a positive effect on people's subjective well-being, and that this will be particularly pronounced for women. Now, I'm just going to set out the methodology. It's a little bit technical, and I must admit that my colleagues Senhu Wang and Jacques Wells, their quantitative skills are much more advanced than mine. So I'll do my best to set this out. And if you have any detailed questions about this, I'll try my best to answer them in the Q&A, but I can also direct you to my colleagues who I'm sure will be really happy to answer specifically. And there's also a paper on this that sets it out in more detail. But in essence, what we do is we use the Understanding Society data set. It's a longitudinal representative panel survey, which started in 2019, but quite useful for our purposes. There was some waves that were implemented during the COVID-19 pandemic that tracked some of the participants throughout that period. And there were 9 specific waves, so a lot of data generated throughout the pandemic. We use waves 6, 8, and 9, just because these were the waves where there was some comparable data on debt that were useful for our studies. The outcome variable was the General Health Questionnaire, GHQ, which is a measure of subjective well-being. In essence, it takes 12 particular questions that measure things like whether your sleep is disrupted, whether you worry or you're anxious about things, and adds up all the scores. 0 means that those individuals are the least distressed. They have, in essence, the better well-being, whereas 36 is those who are most distressed. And that's important. So when we look at the results, anything that is negative means that it's moving towards better subjective well-being. Anything that's positive means that it's moving up to those more distressed levels. The explanatory variables, we had 3 particular variables of interest. The first one was debt excluding mortgages. It was a binary variable, yes or no. The second variable was the total amount of debt. Now, we have separate analyses that looks at that, and I'll provide us a very brief overview, but I'm not going to go into detail because it just provides further patterns to the story, and I want to stick to the main message. And then the third exposure variable was debt and credit payment holiday. And we separate this into 4 particular modalities. We have debt and credit holiday, debt and no credit holiday, no debt and no credit holiday, and no debt and credit holiday. So we have 4 particular groups, each of which capture whether they have debt and whether or not they took on this credit holiday. We also control for a range of fixed and time varying variables. What we mean by that is it could be your employment status that changes over time, your income levels that change over time, but then there are also variables that are fixed, like our gender or our class position, for instance. So we don't really control for those, because I'll explain in a minute with the model that we set up. So the analytical strategy uses a fixed effects regression, which is ultimately used to estimate the model. And we did a lot of tests to make sure that this was the most robust for the purposes that we were interested in. Now, the fixed effects model only controls for some of these time-varying exposure variables, things like changes in debt level and credit holiday, household incomes, and employment status. And as a result of this, we have 2 models, one that doesn't control for any of these covariates, and another one that's a fully adjusted model that controls for socioeconomic characteristics, including household incomes, employment status, and also the presence of pre-pandemic debt and pre-pandemic GHQ, because we want to make sure that we can track a person before the pandemic and then see how their circumstances change throughout. All of the analysis was weighted so that it matched the UK population as best as possible, and we use a software package R in order to carry out these analyses. Okay, so now I'm just going to present some of the main themes from the data, and I don't want to confuse things too much. I just want to kind of talk about the main themes that emerge, but I'm happy to share the slides afterwards, and you know the paper goes into much more detail about this. Table 1, in essence, what it does is it just maps out the descriptive statistics across the different areas. It shows what the pre-pandemic circumstances were and what the pandemic circumstances were. And what we see is that unsecured debt actually stays pretty similar throughout the course of the pandemic, right? We don't see great fluctuations throughout the pandemic. It in essence stabilizes. In relation to the credit score, around 4.1% of the sample took out a credit payment holiday. Sorry, I said credit score there, I meant credit payment holiday. I'm doing a separate project on credit scores at the moment, so that's why it's fresh in my mind. And this increased throughout the pandemic. So we saw that initially in wave 6, it was 3.6%. By wave 9, it went up to 4.5%. Now, table 2 is a little bit more focused on the kinds of analyses that we're interested in. What model 1 does is it highlights that those with debt had a higher score on the GHQ and therefore were more likely to be in financial distress. So we see that with a higher coefficient at this stage. In relation to model 2, what this does is it introduces the credit payment holiday into this and tries to get a sense of, well, how does the credit payment holiday impact this relationship? And what we identify is a positive relationship between reporting debt and no credit holiday. So in essence, what we see is that those who are in debt and don't have a credit holiday have highest prevalence of GHQ scores, so therefore they're more likely to be in some form of distress. Those who report no debt and credit holiday also report lower GHQ scores. So we see this effect here that no debt, no credit holiday, of course, they're in the most favorable kind of circumstances. But when looking at those reporting unsecured debts, which is at this point here, debt and credit holiday, we actually see that there's a negative effect here, which there's an improvement in their GHQ scores. There's an enhancement to their subjective well-being for those who take out these particular credit holidays and who have debt. Now, one of the things that's an issue there is that it includes people who don't have any debts. So what we wanted to do is simplify the model by just including those who have debts to see if that altered the confidence in our estimates and the kinds of results that we found. And all that happens is that those effects are more pronounced. So in essence, when we look at purely those who have debts, then the credit holiday becomes a greater explanatory variable for the kinds of subjective well-being that individuals have. And we see here that the reference category is debt and no credit holiday. For debt and credit holiday in both the non-adjusted and fully adjusted model is negative, which means that there is a significant improvement in the subjective well-being of those who are in debt who take out this credit payment holiday. And as I mentioned, we also performed an analysis that looked at not debt just as a binary variable, but also as a continuous variable. And we found the same effect. It just reproduced the same kinds of analyses. Now, the following figures look at specifically at gender, and they, in essence, replicate the models from 1 and 2. And we see in this example, you see male on the top line, female on the bottom line. The coefficient for females is higher along that spectrum, right? It's because it's on the positive side. In essence, this highlights that women who are in debt are more likely to report higher GHQ scores. Therefore, they're likely to be more in financial distress or some form of subjective distress as a result of their debts. In model 2, it gets a little bit more complicated here because we introduce the credit holiday to see how that impacts the association between debt and gender and mental health. And debt and credit holiday is associated with better mental health outcomes among both females and males. We see that on this side of the spectrum. It's a negative score. Now, when we did further analyses, it shows that debt and no payment holiday have a significantly larger negative effect on mental health for women than for men. In contrast, the payment holiday scheme can reduce mental distress of debt for both men and women, but actually this result was not significant. So although we see a higher score or a higher effect for women, the difference between males and females in this particular results were non-significant. So although it's generally consistent with our suggestion that females are more likely to benefit from credit payment holidays, and we see that there are results that indicate that, the non-significance adds a little bit of caution into that. In essence, we might need better data before we can really make that case. But nonetheless, it's suggesting that that is the direction of travel. So what are the implications of this? Well, what we suggest here is that the credit payment holiday has the potential for significant health benefits. And also the results that we produce, in essence, brings forward this important distinction. It shifts attention from the individual to the impact of governing bodies and their policies on the links between debt and mental health. What we argue is that that the different associations here can actually be the result of the shift away from core neoliberal policies and the policy paradigm. When implementing this policy, we have some examples of this kind of approach. The Bank of England sought to justify it, these distinctions, the kinds of changes in the policy, because they were granted as part of these unprecedented government-led efforts to support the economy, rather than in response to the circumstances of individual borrowers. And what that means is that this distinction, these kinds of policies, neutralize the dominant neoliberal discourse regarding debt repayment obligations. In essence, it destigmatized the effects between debt and failure to repay those particular debts. It meant that the structural causes were removed from the framework, and people were not then in a position where they were being blamed for their circumstances. And what we see is by reducing the levels of stress and the personal stigma of having debt, that we can see by publicly acknowledging these effects of these broader policy changes, we highlight that the neoliberal context is crucial to the kinds of patterns and circumstances that we observe. And given that women are more likely to observe and to experience this failure and personal responsibility with their debts, the slightly better effect of the credit payment holiday on women suggests that this indicates it lowers these stigmatizing effects of falling into debt. I just have these final points to make, which and then I'll finalize my presentation. And so I just want to suggest here that what we're trying to do is draw attention to the political economic context on the gendered links between debt and mental ill health. This scheme has actually now ended. It ended in July 2021, and it was argued that it's no longer needed because the pandemic is over. But we've seen over the preceding months and years that there's a cumulative rise in the amounts of debt that people have, the cost of living crisis, and rising borrowing costs. So it doesn't really make sense why this policy is only needed during a global pandemic and not something that become part of the tools at our disposal to minimize this link. And what we argue is that it seems that this could actually be a long-term policy tool to really sever this connection between debt and mental health, particularly for women who are always on the brunt end of labour market inequalities and unpaid labour. And also it could be a way of mitigating the impact of debt that's fostered by neoliberal political economy. And I will leave it at that point. And this is just one of the articles that have come from that.
Beautiful, thank you. That was really, really fascinating to see the kind of separation there, especially at the gendered level. So thank you so much for sharing that information and some of the implications with us. Looking forward to the discussion. I've already got a few questions for both of our presenters so far. Awesome. I'm going to now turn over to our last presentation before that discussion is able to happen. And that is going to be from Jonathan Warner, who's at the Von Hugel Institute at St. Edmund's College, also locally at University of Cambridge. Title of Jonathan's talk is Policy, Architecture and Infrastructure, Trust, Uncertainty and Expectations. And just like I did for the others, Jonathan, I'll send you a note around 15 minutes. Perfect. Over to you.
Morning, everybody. I hope you can see the screen with the slides on it.
Yes.
Excellent. Yes, I have two screens here, so I can see myself and at the same time. Thank you. Yeah, this is more of a conceptual paper, and I'm interested in feedback on the idea. So I'll keep it as short as I can, and to that end, I've sort of reversed the order which it might go in. The basic idea. Nice to move forward. Yeah, is that there are different effects effects of policy decisions, the ones obvious and visible, that would happen, sorry. But also the effects that we've also been looking at in this conference of the stress, depression, anger, mental health type issues that come from the effects of those policies. I'm also interested, and this is where I want to take what I'm doing today, with the hidden effects of policies itself, the uncertainty that they generate, the way they change expectations, and how people deal with those changes. And of course, those changes in themselves generate the things on the right-hand side of the screen as well. Now, I'm a conventional economist, sort of. I'm interested in Ken's capabilities approach, which Mark briefly mentioned. I'm also interested in intentional communities, which also draw upon things here. But a sort of summary from the orthodox economist type of view that it's a truism in economics that incentives matter, the whole nudges thing that we discussed. So the design of policy matters too, but, and this is what really interests me as a social science, there's a loop. What matters is not only the policy, but how people respond to the policy, respond to the incentives that they get. And that will depend upon the extent that will lead to, or that will affect the extent to which the policy will actually deliver. So we also get an effect on expectations. The policy affects people's expectations of what is going to happen. So that affects their response, and that will affect the outcome of their policy as well. And in the real world, these effects are uncertain, except we seem to see that always it's the poor and other marginalized groups lack the resilience to adapt to the disappointment of their expectations. That's the sort of framework that I'm trying to set up and get your feedback on. So the third model under the Cameron government was the nudging, the behavioural economics type of things. So how do you get children to choose healthy choices at school dinners, the automatic enrolment in pension schemes we talked about before, and automatic subscription renewals, a really nasty one for your convenience. And those are the books. Nudge, I think we're probably all familiar with. The other one, Akerlof and Schiller's Fishing for Fools, puts out the negative of nudges like subscriptions, automatic renewals, and what might be done about them. Now, start by suggesting some features of high trust, high social capital society. This was a place I lived earlier in my career in the American Midwest. The county, the proportion of the state, was very, very pro-Republican, pre-Trump. 2004 election, it had the highest proportion of Republican voters, of those voting anywhere in the US. The view was that you didn't actually need governments to do very much because, contrary to what he was saying, communities had formed, they'd happened on their own almost. But I think she was right that you do need organization. It was a very religious community with a very high trust of neighbors, basically a social sin if you locked your car when you parked it in the town. Very high bonding social capital. It was helped that a lot of people in the community were related to each other. Big networks of friends though. And this meant that bank accounts, we had a student who lived with us for a while, newly arrived from abroad, and on our word, she was allowed to set up a bank account with no ID and no money. I thought was fairly tremendous. So yeah, as I was saying, very high social capital. Just before I arrived in the community, apparently the way that you would buy things was by check in the shop. And in case you forgot your checkbook, each shop had its own checkbook that you could just write instructions to your bank to pay them for what you were buying. No checks beyond, no additional nothing required. So very high social capital. Some problems when new people moved to town. Hispanic population came in. actually went down well with the community because there were a lot of farmers, and hardworking Hispanic labor was attracted to them. And of course, for a Christian community, this is an evangelization community. So a church was set up to help services in Spanish for their benefit. Trust is important. And also, looking at this as a conventional economist, these things trust is useful because it saves on resources. So if you live in a high trust, high social capital society, you can probably manage with a lower financial income than you can in a society where there's not the trust. That it saves on resources, fewer defensive expenditures like locksmiths and so forth, or CCTV to keep your property safe. Trust, another example of trust, benefits of a happy marriage are pretty well documented. And mutual aid it was very, very important as well. For example, if somebody had a medical problem, the insurance, this is America, didn't cover it, then you'd hold potluck lunches or you'd have a fundraising event for them and the community would contribute. So in effect, you were insured by the community. But the problem is with trust, it's easily lost and very hard to gain. In Britain, with the advent of AI, there's been a lot of discussion on trustlessness. We trust and then verify, or can we, with trust-free systems, basically deciding things by algorithms, so blockchain contract, where once you've entered into it, there's no way of getting out of it, like the laws of the Medes and Persians. The problem there is, of course, the biases and issues with algorithms themselves. How to show that you're trustworthy? Well, American banks, the same as the Bank of England, impressive neoclassical buildings showing that, yes, this, if it's been around for a long time, therefore it must be a good institution. Lack of trust. Ralph Yarl was shot by Andrew Lester in the US last week. What he'd done was rang the wrong doorbell, trying to collect a member of the family. If you don't trust people, those are the costs that get imposed. Second element I'm interested in is uncertainty. There's a whole literature on the difference between risk and uncertainty. And for economists, usually if there's risk, we can measure it. We know the probabilities of various outcomes, and that's as good as for coming up with causes and their effect as knowing the event explicitly. Flexibility, different probabilities is less necessary for the rich because financial resources are there to help if there's unexpected or low probability disaster happens. If you don't know probabilities as well, events are uncertain, black swan events, known unknowns, those types of things, which means it's very, very hard to plan for and know what you're going to do. Uncertainty. This is a graph I love from the Financial Times. It shows the level of business investment in the UK. That's the blue line, and the pink line is the trend as things were between 2009 and 2015. Of course, in 2016, certainties of the Brexit after the referendum occurred, and that is what caused the uncertainty that follows. Finally, the three trust, uncertainty, expectations. If you don't trust what you're told, what you expect, and economists model this, firstly, adaptive expectations. The future will be like the past, which is true if you're a turkey until it gets to early December. They feed you every day, and you go for your food, and the food gets more every day, and then suddenly in early December, you lose your head. Rational expectation, you form your expectations based on all relevant information available. This is helpful because during the Cold War period, trying to work out what the other side would do, particularly in the West, was through game theory, saying that facts made can be credible or incredible. If they're credible, you have to do something about them. If they're incredible, you can probably ignore them. Hence the problem, the madman problem that came. Is Vladimir Putin at the minute rational in the threats that he's making? He's mentioned nuclear war, but hasn't actually threatened it directly, which suggests maybe he is a rational actor, and therefore we can continue these game wars. It's rather risky. And there's another unexpected thing. It's interesting as well. We do like to know what people think, because that will affect the way that policy works. I think this is rather like the co-production idea that Mark was mentioning. And that was one that came out this week on how AI might affect jobs in the US. And you see that people think there will be big effects, not on them personally so much. People are divided about whether the effects are going to be positive or negative. But where this has gone in economics is that basically only surprises can affect behavior. Moreover, we discovered that people don't trust politicians very much. They do trust central banks more. So central banks running monetary policy without politicians interfering, without direct democratic control, actually works quite well. I think that's probably taken a bit off from our subject today. It's more on social policy, which is probably more relevant. One thing that interests me as well is the value of pre-commitment, giving a certain measure of security to what might happen. But it requires presumably trust that you will make a pre-commitment to something like marriage, and the benefits of it become higher the bigger the greater the trust is. So commitment as a demonstration of trust might also be important. So why get married? Well, the lifelong commitment is, after love, the next most common answer to that question. And I think I need to bring this to a close, so I'll skip through that one and just move straight to the end. So that was the slide of the mechanism that I thought that I started with. So you take a policy, cut benefits, for example. I'm thinking here of the reduction of universal credit at the end of the pandemic. You're going to have those real effects over on the right, and those are going to lead to the problems of mental health and so forth that's been discussed. But I'm so interested in these hidden effects, how people will react to that policy announcement. It generates a sort of uncertainty. What will happen to my benefits? I was expecting to be able to use this money for something. Now I'm not going to get it. This means I'm going to have to change what I do. What am I going to do? Am I going to go along with it, which is going to make life difficult and increase the stress, anger, guilt, and depression? Am I going to avoid it and find some other way to get what I need, get another job, something like that? Am I going to evade it? In other words, just get a job and not kill anybody and hope I can get universal credit and the payment for it. Any of those is going to lead to the set of problems, the pathologies over on the right: stress, depression, anger, guilt, and shame. And the nasty one about shame is hidden, and that makes solving problems that result from shame more difficult because they're not. You can see the red arrow on the right. That's suggesting there's a joint interaction that from stress, depression, anger, the paralysis from those sorts of lower effects, able to work. Worrying about consumption leads to you trying to cut back or making inappropriate decisions. More debt, more work, so more problems with children and so forth, which leads to more stress, depression, anger, guilt, and paralysis. That's how the model works. I'd be very interested in feedback on whether this has got any merit in it at all. Secondly, how it can be taken further. How do we build capacity? So in this case, it wouldn't be just concerns with income and mental health and so forth, but how do we do, I think where Mark was headed, assisting people to make better decisions? How can we reduce uncertainty? And I suppose for our politicians who are very keen to say everything's perfect, don't overpromise, make realistic statements so that people can form their expectations on more realistic scenarios than on what politicians would have us believe. So I'll stop at that point, if I may, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and for just absolutely brilliantly coping with the tech issue in the middle. I know that can sometimes be destabilizing.
Yeah, that was unexpected. It led to a change in uncertainties and so forth. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah,
well, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about how incentives or behaviors are prompted by certain types of policy offers or the removal of benefits, as your model is trying to probe into, which is really fascinating. But this is the time where we get to invite questions and some broader discussion amidst the panel. I think we've got lots to think about, especially related to the cost of poorly managed or implemented policy, the costs of failing to consider potentially or to engage properly with those for whom the policy is meant to benefit, as well as a bunch of other methodological issues that I think have been raised in really, really interesting ways by our panelists. So I'm happy to have people start to consider their questions, and I open the floor to the audience. Oh, Daniel, over to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for all of the presentations. They're really interesting. I had a question, well, a couple of questions, if that's okay. So the first was in relation to Matthew's presentation and the kind of process of like, how do you systematize, I guess, co-production into kind of different policy domains and subdomains. So experts by experience is something that's it feels like it's quite a live issue at the moment, at least in certain policy spaces. And I think it's been really interesting to see how it's developed over the last few years. I don't know did you work with Abby Meadows at Turn? Yeah, sorry, I've got the wrong person, haven't I? I meant Mark, sorry. Sorry. Yeah, so one of the critiques of the kind of experts by experience process and co-production practices is that very often experts by experience are in trying to sort of demonstrate their expertise are expected to kind of trade on the trauma of their lived experience, and that can feel quite icky in certain kind of policy spaces. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on how experts by experience can demonstrate the kind of value of what they can bring to the table without kind of trading on trauma, particularly in trying to sort of systematize co-production, because as you kind of really effectively demonstrated, it takes so much time, and it's a really complicated process to get it right. And then the second question was on avoiding marginalization and oppression being something that's supplementary. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on the extent to which that is actually kind of distinct, and whether that falls under kind of freedom and autonomy. Sorry for getting your name wrong.
No, that's totally fine. I'll take your questions in reverse order. No, I don't think marginalization is distinct. Like, I certainly think like the capabilities approach would say that, you know, if you're marginalized, then it's not going to be good for your well-being. At the same time, I think the severity of marginalization and the centrality of that to thriving in financial hardship is kind of particularly acute relative to if I was doing well-being public policy with a different demographic. So I think in this particular context, if you are trying to improve people's thriving, then you need to have marginalization much more front of mind than if you were doing it in, well, like at the moment I'm house sitting in Winchester, which is a very kind of lovely bougie town outside London. And I think if you did a similar co-production exercise here for what thriving in Winchester means and what the local government should do, then I suspect that the kinds of marginalization we're talking about might be relevant to a few people in the community, but would not be kind of as front of mind as an issue. I really liked your question about co-production, and this is something that I guess I ponder a lot and that Abby thinks about a lot too. My ex-partner works a lot on system change evaluation in the kind of complex disadvantage space, mostly working for the government, and she finds that there are huge numbers of kind of grifters basically coming into this space, kind of marketing themselves as lived expert consultants and this kind of thing. There's really kind of no sophistication about it. They just keep repeating slogans. There is this kind of deliberation fetishism where there's this idea that if you just give people with lived experience a microphone, they'll like solve all your problems or something. I think that definitely trades on the trauma, as you say, but it also just kind of puts a burden on those people as far as a policy expectation is concerned that's unreasonable and unrealistic, and really kind of sets lived experience up to fail, I think. It seems to me like the integration of lived experience into policy development has to be done hand in hand with these other expert groups. And I think as I'm thinking more about this kind of 3-group model that we have, I would definitely kind of break out those groups a bit further sometimes. So within the practitioners, you want people like Abby who are really doing a lot of co-production all the time and thinking about how to do it well, to kind of create a wholesome structure around how the people who live the experience are integrated into the design process that kind of thinks about each of them individually and what they can bring to the process and what sort of platforms might be helpful to them. So I'll just give you one example that I think about a lot because I'm not sure we did the best job of it. But as you say, co-production is quite time-consuming, quite challenging. I think our project, we were concerned that it was quite intellectually challenging. And so the way we thought that there would probably be some people who wouldn't be quite up to that task for the working group process, but we didn't want to exclude people who might be a little bit slower on the uptake with some of these things from giving us their perspective, because a lot of people that turn to us works for are like that. So in the so we brought those people in more from the workshop and we gave them a kind of narrower task, much more time to prepare for it, paid them for that preparation time, accepted that it would take them longer, that sort of thing. So I think, yeah, mostly for me, it's about having kind of specialists in co-production who do have a fairly sophisticated understanding both of it and of the policy process, and then they can kind of structure that nexus in a way that makes it compatible. But this is like very ongoing research for me. I have some other charities that I'm working with now, and hopefully we can work with either the Greater London Authority or the North of Tyne to kind of co-produce a lot of their wellbeing policy, but that won't get to that till the end of the year. Yeah, definitely interested if you have any comments on this stuff, please reach out to me.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. It's really interesting.
Okay, thanks.
Great, thanks. We've got a question in the chat from Susan, and it's for Matthew. And the question, I think it's methodological. It has to do with splitting by gender. And Susan wants to know, is this insufficient and potentially misleading without accounting for the size of household and parental status?
Thank you very much for that question. I think that we do control for the size of the household. So we have whether a person is in a single occupancy household, whether they are living with another individual, and also the number of children. That is one of the variables that we control for. My understanding, and this is where I would pull my colleagues in to center these particular questions. So although I have expertise in more of cross-sectional analyses, my longitudinal understanding is a little bit a bit weaker. And in the paper, what we do is we actually present the results from both the fixed effects and the random effects models. And the random effects models do allow us to at least understand the impacts of some of those fixed characteristics around a person's socio-demographic criteria. But we perform something called a Hausman's test, which in essence compares the difference between a fixed effects and random effects models to see which one is the most suited to this particular analysis, which reveals the most robust data. And in that test, it suggested the fixed effects model was the one that we should highlight. But in our paper, we articulate both of those particular models, and one of them does recognize these broader set of characteristics, not just reducing it down to a binary distinction between males and females, but recognizing that there might be situational differences that each experience. And of course, we control for those in our particular model to make sure that we can be confident that it is a gendered effect. Of course, there are limitations in the way that gender is classified here. We are moving away from a binary distinction in the way that we understand gender in the social sciences. But unfortunately, the surveys are a little bit slower in shifting some of its methodologies to account for that. But hopefully that's something that might become more prevalent in future data sets. I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, then please let's communicate via email, and anything that I cannot describe, I will definitely seek my colleagues' expertise on that matter.
Thanks, Matthew. Where is this paper coming out? You mentioned it was forthcoming.
Yes, it's in Society of Mental Health. So
great.
We're just going through the proofreading of it to make sure everything's correct, and then it should be out probably in a month or two, something like that.
Excellent. I was going to say that lots of papers have been shared over the last panel as well as the last day. Perhaps there might be a way that we could find a kind of infrastructure, like digitally, to share some of this really exciting work. But with that, I see that Mark has raised a hand to ask a question. So over to you.
You're
muted. You're muted.
Sorry, it's just a comment really. So we have a paper in PLOS One where we look at mood during COVID. We have kind of daily mood data from 1,000 Brits. Sorry, actually I've started this wrong. So one of the most striking things that we uncovered when we were doing this research that isn't in our data set, but that there was this really precipitous drop in suicides during COVID in the UK that you're probably aware of. And when we looked into that, it seems to be very heavily concentrated in unemployed men. And looking at our data as well in this mood data, and we mostly construct an index out of it, we found that a lot of the reductions in negative mood states, it was basically mostly old people who are afraid of dying from COVID, so that's quite understandable. But the other demographic where it was quite noticeable was, again, unemployed men. So I'm just wondering if I don't know what your reaction are to that, basically. So it seemed to us that we couldn't figure it, disentangle it in our data why that was happening, but our suspicion was basically what you had said, that the reduction in stigma from not seeming incompetent for not having a job and also not having to go and look for a job all the time probably meant that there was more leisure and that sort of thing. Do you have any reactions?
Yeah, I think that one of the, I should highlight this as one of the limitations, and we note this in our results, that we don't directly test for stigma within our accounts. We are we are nudging our analysis in that direction, but as yet we don't quite have the data to really pinpoint whether that's the case. But I suppose, you know, if you can kind of use the same lens really to look at the way that welfare has been stigmatized over the, you know, from in the 1980s, but then again from the 2010 period. And there's a lot of research that's been that showcases that, in particular how that was used to justify austerity politics. And you know, we know from research conducted in the US, and I think Daniel will be very familiar with this, and Matthew Desmond's recent work highlights how many, I think it's 1 in 5 of the population who are eligible for some of the welfare benefits there don't take them because they don't want to be associated with those negative connotations with it. And so what strikes me there is that within the pandemic, welfare through furlough schemes and so on was normalized. It was the first time in the UK where we'd seen policies such as that, where the government were actively showcasing how generous they were to people who were no longer able to work as a result of the pandemic. And within that, I think it would open up the space for maybe even men who are long-term unemployed, maybe unemployed before the pandemic, for the effects of their unemployment to be minimized and for them to actually take up some of the schemes that were available to them that before they may have felt were too contentious or were too stigmatizing to adopt. So I think that will be interesting to see whether there's a difference between long-term unemployed males and also those who became unemployed during the pandemic, to see actually whether we see a reduction amongst both of those groups, which might then point to some of these neutralizing effects of welfare changes. But who knows? I mean, I'm not even sure if we have the data on that, but your data sounds fascinating, Mark.
Just drawing attention to everyone that Mark did copy that into the chat for all of us. I've already clicked on the link and added it to my Zotero to read for later. So thank you very much, Mark. Daniel, did you want to weigh in on this?
If nobody else has a question, I'm conscious I've already asked one, but just picking up on what Mark and Matthew were saying there, and it was something that I actually wanted to ask about your presentation, Jonathan. So you talked about the kind of that feedback loop, right? So like what matters is how kind of people respond to policy. But when you kind of opened your presentation, you were talking about kind of real effects and hidden effects. And in relation to that, I was in that feedback loop, thinking about what Mark and Matthew were saying there. I guess it's also matters just as much how policy responds to people, and like whether that's through incentive architecture or not. And it just strikes me how, you know, in those hidden effects, those kind of situations where, I don't know, people don't claim welfare or they don't engage with the service, and this feels like a real kind of, it's like a paradox of policy, in that you have kind of an absence of something. And how do you kind of well, first kind of conceptualize that in relation to the policy making process, but then how do you respond to absence? And like what does absence mean within particular policy domains? So I just wondered if you had any kind of reflections on that at all in relation to your presentation.
Daniel, that's really helpful. That's the sort of thing I was looking for. The way feedback loop is, policy non-uptake, because that could be through ignorance or through deliberate problems. What went through my mind was maybe an analogy with the EU settlement scheme. The requirement in Britain that after you've got pre-settled status, you have to apply for further set of documentation, and a big worry that many people would not do that. Either they'd forget they were supposed to, or they weren't seeing the advertisements telling them that they should. They'd moved, so letters sent to their address and so forth. Would this mean that people would not be aware that they had to do this extra step? And the government has now conceded that probably it will not try to enforce that and try and throw people out of the country because they failed to do that. That would be a sort of ignorant thing. If you deliberately decide not to take up a particular thing, that might be because of the stigmatization effect that we've talked about. I remember when I was young, the idea of accepting charity was sort of stigmatized. Yeah, that would partly go back to policy design, that you want to make sure that all the people that you want to get a particular benefit actually get it in the easiest way possible. So during the pandemic, it seemed to be very easy with the universal credit system to uplift amounts very quickly and then shut them down again at the end of the pandemic. But yeah, those that refuse to participate, or actually refuse is the wrong word, those that are not participating in the system are always going to be hard to reach. And how you design policy so that you do reach those of people who do not want to reach, but you think it would be good if they were, is going to be problematic. Basically, I need to think more about that, I think. Thank you very much for that point. Thank you.
If it's okay to just come back on that very quickly. So like I'm thinking about the case of food banks at the moment. So demand is kind of outstripping supply. Food hubs are only able to help so much. So number of parcels provided is somehow a proxy of need, right? But it's, you know, it's not necessarily, because the resources and capacity that that food bank has are finite. And I guess like thinking about that within a kind of more like thinking about a kind of statutory service, whether it's to do with kind of children or like health interventions, you could have an engagement with a service being some kind of, that's your kind of like formal output, your an outcome. So we've seen X number of people, we've done X number of operations, but then there's a whole range of people that may not have engaged with a service. And I guess it's kind of trying to unpack why that might be the case. So those that got the service, needed the service, they were able to access the service, all good. But then in certain cases, it may be a lack of knowledge, it may be the poor design of a service, or it may be a kind of an acuteness of need that isn't kind of accounted for or reflected. And I think kind of, well, just sort of bring it back to the theme of the conference, it feels like that's something that's really hard to kind of get your head around as a policymaker in terms of kind of evaluation. Sorry, it's a bit of
another one into the mix as well. People who knew about the food bank and would think about going for it, then think my need really is great as everybody else's. Maybe I shouldn't go if there's a shortage. And what do you do with those sorts of situations?
Thank you for that enlightening back and forth. That was great. It's reminding me of a lot of the kind of questions emerging around like technology non-use, which would be maybe analogous. Susan Wyatt's work kind of comes to mind first. Sally Wyatt just kind of comes to mind just in this, just trying to conceptualize and also access and engage those who aren't reachable. That was just a thought. But in the final 4 minutes, I think I might take my prerogative as chair and just come back to some of the questions that I have. And I think, so I've got one from Matthew and one from Mark, just in the interest of time. Matthew, you said you disagreed with Ranjan Paul Datta's work yesterday, and I was wondering, when listening to your presentation, if it was potentially on a different register, like thinking about the ways that neoliberalism helps us understand how people internalize certain forms of responsibility around debt. And maybe that was the register, because my interpretation of that was that it was more about trying to understand kind of like sociologically how capital, or the mode of capital of production, actually functions isn't as great in terms of the symbolic resource of neoliberalism that we have now. But I was curious if that was where your disagreement lies. And Mark, I actually just wanted to hear a bit more about your question about like why it is that comparison across jurisdictions for you isn't as important. I mean, you talked about a kind of interesting way of scaling, but I was just interested in a little bit more about the kind of like potentially methodological move that you're making there. So 1 minute each, go.
All right, I will try to do that in 1 minute. I think the first thing to recognize is that processes of neoliberalization are distinct in different national contexts. So it may well be the case that the speaker yesterday was referring to Canada, and which is distinct to the UK. But I understand neoliberalism across three particular levels. The first is kind of like the values it embeds, the notion of individualism, entrepreneurialism, the competition, the particular policies that it adopts around markets as the main engine of economic growth, fiscal conservatism, welfare state retrenchment, active labour market policies, and the prioritization of stable and low inflation over full employment. And then finally is in the discursive processes that help to legitimate that, i.e. this discourse of individualized financial responsibility, responsibility around taking care of your own needs through the market instead of relying on the state. And when I look at places like the UK, for instance, we have seen a shift after the COVID-19 pandemic towards all of those particular elements. And of course, we still see aspects of this government intervention in the energy market. What I would argue is we're seeing this notion of crisis Keynesianism is acceptable in moments of rupture, but then there's an attempt to re-legitimize neoliberalism once that the immediate kind of effects of that rupture are over. And in the UK in particular, you know, we're moving back to these neoliberal policies, the discursive legitimation of those policies, and then the re-stigmatization of things around welfare, debt, etc. So that's my argument.
Eloquently and eruditely put. Thank you. Over to you, Mark.
Can I just quickly say, I would also say that neoliberalism is very much alive and well in British public management. But I guess it is kind of zombie in the sense that people do seem to realize that it's broken, but there is no alternative being proposed. And I think alternatives are kind of out there in a lot of, say, the hybrid models that the Scandinavians use, for example, but there doesn't seem to be much appetite to apply them, much imagination, particularly in the political class. On the comparisons question, I guess I'm coming at this a lot directly in response to kind of the cost-benefit analysis way that a lot of Treasury officials think. So there's this presumption in economics that what would be rational is if we could get a cost-benefit ratio in a unidimensional utility framework, rank everything, every policy, submarines, domestic violence, shelters, schools, whatever, top to bottom in terms of the cost-benefit ratio, fund until we run out of money. And I think this is completely irrational because that's just not at all what reality is like. So for starters, your public policy outcomes are mostly the product of systems. And it's very difficult to kind of point to discrete policies and particularly discrete interventions that you can say, well, this does X, and then I'm going to do the cost benefit analysis of that. It's also the case that there are substantial path dependencies around how funding is distributed, and that's good. Like those path dependencies have developed through kind of Burkean conservative notion of, you know, well, this kind of seems to work, just kind of muddle through, get it better. If we were to dramatically alter the way we distribute funds, then I think we would run into a lot of problems straight away. And then it's also the case, I think, that the outcomes that you are interested in different contexts are multidimensional and are generally radically incommensurable. So if you think about national defense, I just don't think that you can say, oh, well, what is the cost-benefit ratio of national defense in terms of utility or whatever kind of well-being theory you have, life satisfaction, and compare that to domestic violence shelters. So I think actually from public management, rather than from this very top-down analytical view, you want to think about like all the things that your government is doing and seems to have been doing for a while, and then just kind of optimize from the bottom up. And I think this kind of approach where you have contextual sensitive stuff, but then obviously there is a higher level of aggregation. So can we get up from there, I think is a more sensible approach.
Really interesting. Thank you all so much. Thanks again to our panelists. This has been really fascinating and insightful.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everyone for your contributions.
Thanks.